I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that she's so gracious in how she approaches things, and it's my very distinct pleasure, and really an honor.
Can you talk louder, please?
Sure. Said it's my distinct pleasure and an honor to introduce Maressa, my daughter-in-law, also, and just really to begin a conversation about this book. I'm a long-time reader. I love to read. My face is probably familiar here in Chaucer's, but it's really a marvel to me when someone can create a story wholesale, just bring it to life, and she's really done it with this book. So proud of you.
Thank you.
Very exciting. I'm gonna just ask her a few questions to get the conversation sort of jump started about the book, and let her explain some things to us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and then you'll have a chance to get your book signed and introduce yourself. Okay? So I think that really, not being a writer and being just amazed by the process, my first question is, how did you really settle on this particular type of a story and this genre for your first foray into writing a book, publishing a book?
I think it was easy. It was an easy choice because I grew up reading science fiction and fantasy, predominantly fantasy, so it's the genre I know best. I do not have formal training in writing. I did study language and literature, but I've not, prior to writing this book, had taken no workshops, had read no craft books, so it was all sort of a regurgitation of everything I had ingested over the course of 30 years is when I started writing it. So it was just doing what I knew best and then trying to figure out how to write a story. It was easiest to lean on the genre in that way.
Right.
So,
right. So, good, thanks. Well, for me personally, I'm not a big fan of fantasy usually, or magical realism, or kind of that genre. So when I first started reading it, I'll be honest, it was a little difficult for me, especially I was captivated by this idea of world building, where you use your imagination to create a whole nother land, which she's done beautifully. But what I struggled with at the very beginning was some of the language, both how the language is used and some of the words that were completely new. It's a whole new vocabulary because, of course, it's a new world. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came up with this unfamiliar vocabulary and maybe share the meaning behind some of the words that are really essential to the story.
okay, this is where I do the Jon Stewart note-taking
Yeah.
things. World building is essential to when you're creating a secondary world. It's become a really popular term lately. I don't even necessarily know that it was used prior to 10 years ago, although that is, of course, what everyone was doing, from like Robert Heinlein to George Martin. I think when I want to escape to a world, it's Western European, because that's just where my interests have lied throughout the course of my adolescence, predominantly in reading, and then my early adulthood. So there's a little bit of romanticization of the Middle Ages period, and I chose specifically the era when the printing press was not brand new, but 50 to 100 years in. So to be able to zone in on that time period gave me a lot of ability to research, but then from there also create like novelty within that space. So because a lot of people are avoidant of fantasy for the extravagances of dragons and things like that, I think that I wanted it to feel real. So when you enter into this world, it doesn't feel, it could read more like historical fiction, and then there are these elements that are a little bit different. So in that sense, it's like an analog version of our Middle Ages. World building is really just fun, I think. And for me, with some of the naming of things, I think if you read, there's lots of different writers who talk about the importance of naming a thing. Someone who I really admire, Patrick Rothfuss, he even, like, the whole kind of power of his magic system is in the naming of a thing, and it's when you can name a thing that you truly can wield this power. So I put a lot of time and energy into the naming of things. So
some examples, maybe?
Yeah. Within that, I used, I did not make up names or words. I drew on real languages, predominantly Scottish and Irish Gaelic, and Attic Greek, which I have a little bit of a proficiency in, having studied classics in college. So there was a personal connection there. I am Scottish as well, do not speak Gaelic, but have long been interested in all kinds of lore as it pertains to those lands. So with the Dactyli, the order of ancient druids, that their storyline is a predominant focus of the book. The name Dactyli is Greek. It literally means fingers, and there's actually a mirroring between the bureaucratic fingers and the fingers of this ancient order, without giving too much of a spoiler alert there. So, and so in Greek mythology, the Dactyli there's all these kinds of associations attributed to them, but they were predominantly associated with the Great Mother, which is very associated with the mythology of my book. And smiths, metalsmiths, alphabet, and mathematics. So when you think about those things, the Dactyli are concerned with truth. And I think when a lot of people think about truth, what is true, we use words, we use math, and we use like the perfect science of the forge. So to me, like, I wanted those real world associations to be infused into what their order meant, whether or not it's conscious for the reader. There's all of these cultural connections that are going into the experience of the name of that. So it might land for a reader, it might be an Easter egg for one, it might go over someone's head, but it's there, and I think that those connected pieces, like throughout time, is really cool.
Right. That's great. Thank you. And as you read along, one, you become more familiar with the words and their meanings, and they become defined. And also, I found I just let go and let them wash over you and immerse yourself in the story, which is so easy to do because it's a great story.
I think that a lot of people read fantasy because they like to assimilate into those worlds, and then for that very same reason it stresses other readers out, and it's just like I want to be able to understand everything that's going on and think about relational problems or things that are more relative to me, and then for other people it's just pure escape.
But I think for this book, for that reason, was lovely to read for me because, like you said, you mentioned you have a background in classics with language and literature as an emphasis, and so in addition to being a lovely adventure story and with a really classic kind of adventure tale, there are a lot of larger themes and even some archetypes and different tropes. And I wonder if you could speak to the themes that you've woven in and some that are especially important to you.
Yeah. So I do not think I reinvented the wheel with the plot of this book. I think I was talking to my husband earlier. It's like nestled within the plot beats, like very classic plot beats of an epic fantasy. There are no searing twists. It's my first book. But I am really proud about the themes and the ideas that were infused into these more classic plot beats. So there are 3 pretty big themes. I don't know if we want to just go into one to start. I think so. The Dactyli Order are really concerned with this notion of objective truth. Their whole thing throughout time has been to harness their pretty potent powers for this singular purpose, which is to go around the land, collect memories from people, from trees, from stones, from any like sentient or sensate, which in my book the earth is sensate, and collect these memories, take them back to their little chamber of secrets, and then they have these scribes who kind of go over these memories, these subjective memories as experienced by people, and they curate them into this one objective truth. And they've got this big library, it's burgeoning with all these truths for thousands of years. So that's like their whole thing, but their order is in decay. They're no longer really of interest to the people. They used to be seen as mystics, as sages, and people would come to them once a year, kind of like oracles in ancient Greece function. People would go to them for answers, and it hasn't been like that for hundreds of years. So I was interested in this notion of truth. I started writing this book in 2020, and to me, it was really interesting to watch what was happening culturally. It felt like consensus reality has sort of been crumbling since before the internet, but it was in 2020 with COVID and then this last election where it really seemed obvious and a little bit frightening how people are just living in totally different realities. And it just led me to really think about truth and what makes a thing true. I have a friend who is a data scientist, and we had some really long conversations about variables and how when you just change one variable, your son, the whole data set's defunct, and what was proven is no longer true, and it's null and void. So I'm not trying to lead the reader in any one direction, but I do kind of want the reader to examine, how do you decide what is true, what leads you down that path, how easy is it for you to make that decision. So yeah, it was just like something that I was tripping out about during that time, and it just got infused into the work. So it's kind of like a big think piece throughout the whole book text.
Thank you. Great. And there are definitely some other big themes. There's one that I especially appreciated was this idea of a hero and what makes a hero and who can be a hero and where that power comes from. I think that's a theme that resonated with me. Let's see. I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll see if anyone has any questions for Maressa, if that's okay. So my final question is, well, really, it's not even a question. It's just to kind of lead in to say that the book is very evocative, and you feel so in like wrapped in nature in this book, both through the metaphors she uses, the descriptions, and really the story itself has so much to do with our connection with nature, our disengagement. Just there's a lot of pieces there. So Maressa's going to read a short passage from her book, a little passage, and that speaks a little bit to this and speaks a little bit about the story. We just wanted to make sure we didn't give any spoilers when we had this discussion, so it's towards the beginning of the book.
Yeah, so this is a headier passage, like both from what it's conveying and how it's written, so trust that the whole book does not read like this, but I think it's good because there are no spoilers. And it just gives a really good overview about what the Dactyli's whole pursuit has been over the last 1,000 years, and what one of our main characters is dealing with at the beginning of his character arc.
Can we just interrupt for a minute?
Yeah.
And if there are any of the words that you think we might not be familiar with in the passage,
Sure.
could you define
Preface?
them ahead of time
certainly.
for us? It might help.
That's perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to say Morachath, which is a Gaelic word, and it literally means reflection. It's where the Dactyli live. It's in a very remote location, wind-blown, freezing cold, down by the sea. And I'm going to use the Grasp, which is the nation, the realm. I'm going to use Cuimhne Mas, which it means absolute truth in Gaelic as well. So actually I'm going to use a few more words. So there's skull. Actually, this is these are almost the only words. They're all here. They're all here.
And they're the most important of the words throughout the book.
Yeah.
So,
So there's skull, which are the memories or events that they go around and collect, and then there's skull act, which is the distillation of those memories. So Morachath, Cuimhne Mas, skull act, the grasp, and then of course Dactyli. So a lot of world building in this section. No dialogue because that would have made me nervous. Another gust of sea spittle struck him full in the face, stinging his eyes and coating his beard with still more salt, but he did not flinch. Much as he was disinclined toward the sea, this beach below the Morachath was the only place where he could be alone with his thoughts. It didn't matter that their halls were more empty now than they had been in 1,000 years. The stone that shaped its walls and passageways could still see him, could still hear him. And while that stone could not divine his thoughts or speak to issue forth judgment, Lovelace could not help but feel the weight of its knowing, of those Dactyli who had come before him, who had walked those same passageways, pursuing the same fruitless cause as he. He stabbed at a bubble, bursting it before it had chance to swell. His Dactyli forebears had not seen their pursuit as worthless. They'd been fed on the same fodder as Lovelace, and grown large in their steady grazing of the noble and righteous path of truth. But things had been different then. Those Dactyli had gone on their rangings just as he, gathering skulls from every crevice and every crag, and in earlier times, from beyond even the furthest reaches of the grass. They had brought these hard-won skulls back to the Morachath so that the scribes might distill them, for rangers were nothing so much as hunters, gatherers of threads that only scribes could weave into tapestries of truth. These greater narratives they called skullacts, and they were stored and kept and once yearly, shared with those who would wish to know what certainties the Dactyli could give them after another year of careful collection and curation. They were meant to be tangible, living things, these skullacts, illuminating patterns and cycles that could be kept in perpetuity, relied upon as the firmament upon which still further truths could be built, tall and straight as columns. Queemni Amas, truth absolute, the most noble of all pursuits. For all the good it's done us, Lovelace thought gloomily as he wrung his salt-soaked beard. He had been on 267 rangings, Gunnar by his side for all save the first. Together they had coaxed tales of treachery from trees, obtained old wives' tales from weather-beaten stone. They had taken accounts of great deeds and terrible deeds and everything in between, from children and maidens, farmers and city folk. Gone were the acquisitions of natural phenomenon, the workings of the mother, of the natural world. The Dactyli masters presumed to know all there was of earth and its turnings, and had, for the last 300 years, curved their wrinkled necks to mankind and his machinations. But the minds of men and women were as twisted and gnarled as the singular branches of a juniper tree, yearning for the sky. And so their skullacts grew more and more strange, ever reaching, ever branching, ever growing toward plateaus of certitude in an endless expanse. In time, their library grew bright with truths that battled one another, burgeoned with patterns that bore imperfect weaves. And the people, for whom the order sought to give succor with the depth and breadth of their knowing, slowly began to turn elsewhere for their solace, elsewhere for their schemes. And the Dactyli had wilted like flowers, gone over long without the warmth of the sun, left to do as they had always done in their cold crypt by the sea.
Nice.
So, are there any questions from anyone here?
Who's your favorite character?
Ooh,
Piff.
that's a great one.
Piff,
Yes.
Piff.
a stable boy.
Why?
Why? He just, it's such a cliche to say he jumped off the page, but his voice was just, he was there inside. I didn't have to work him. I didn't have to figure out who he was. He was just so apparent from the very beginning. And if you've read it, you know he has a very unique way of speaking, and it might seem like it was, I don't know, I had to figure that out, but I didn't. It was just,
How he
it was
talked.
right there, yeah.
Yes, I haven't read your book yet, sorry, but I just
Okay.
wanted to ask which authors, fantasy authors or other authors, have been most inspirational to you?
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the board. I read a lot of fantasy, but I also read quite a bit of literary fiction and historical fiction. You want the long answer or the short answer? I think directly for this book, Patrick Rothfuss was a really strong influence, both in the kind of tale and the kind of writing. It's very lyrical. It's very whimsical. And I really appreciate the way that Diana Gabaldon, she doesn't world build necessarily, but she makes worlds, it brings them to life, our old worlds in such a beautiful way. So I love Joan Didion for her scything style of writing, which doesn't really show up so much in this book, but she's been pretty influential to me. And I loved Philippa Gregory growing up. She's historical fiction. And who else? A lot of Terry Pratchett. He doesn't show up at all in this book, but in other things that I write, he certainly does.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What about you yourself, as far as your writing, and how did you come about to sit down and write a novel?
Yeah, so I didn't really start to write in a fiction way until I was 30. So I'm probably going to regret saying this to a camera, but I'm pretty proud of the fact that this is actually the first book I've ever written. And a lot of people have advised me not to share that, but I feel pretty proud of the fact that it is.
Mhm.
And so I've always loved words, and I wrote a mean email back in the day when I was working in business and trying to bring a point home. But it was during the pandemic. I stepped away from a position as the director of operations, and it was actually my husband's idea, who knew that I had these ambitions, and he suggested that now was the time to do it. And so with his love and support, I began, and yeah, haven't really looked back since.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you mentioned how for Pith, he kind of just like came out and you didn't really have to work him. I was wondering if like for the other characters, like if there were any ways or specific tactics that like helped you like develop these characters and like find that bond between them, or if they kind of just like happened.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like I said, I didn't know that much about creating characters when I first set out, so I had a lot of backtracking to do, specifically with Loveless. Kylene felt a little bit more personal and easy to write because there are shades of every character of yourself, but she especially felt like I was writing kind of a younger version of myself, so that didn't feel terribly difficult. But Loveless, I had to really ask, not just what does he want, because that was obvious to me, but how does he change? Otherwise, he appears really flat on the page. This is something that I learned, and so I think the biggest thing too is having other people perceive your character as beta readers, people you trust, and have them tell you it's not working for me. So it wasn't until someone, actually the woman who wrote the blurb for my book, read the first 3 chapters of my novel, and she was like, I love where Kylene is and where she's going, and I just, Loveless isn't doing it for me. So other people's perceptions can be helpful, knowing what they want, how they change, and do they get what they want. I think knowing those things before you start to write is helpful, and definitely would have been helpful in writing Loveless from the start.
Mm.
So I'm curious about the writing process. I haven't read the book, but I'm curious if you had an outline, and did you know how it would end, or did you make it up as you went?
Yeah, I'm what they call a plantser, so I'm somewhere in between. I'm not a planner, I'm not a pantser. A pantser is someone who just flies by the seat of their pants. I've also heard it
Among other
described,
things,
as like the flashlight method, where you can shine a light, you know where you're going, but everything between there is dark. So for me, I didn't start writing the book knowing how it would start all the plot beats from beginning to end, but as I began to write, the next plot beat would become obvious, and I think the end I knew kind of by the beginning, by the middle, and then just from there it was processional, and then once it was finished, of course, it had to be read through, and certain things needed to be changed, without a doubt. But I don't know. I've never tried to write by an outline.
Were you ever surprised by?
Oh, constantly,
Okay.
yeah.
So it was a self-discovery.
Yeah, it's so much fun. Yeah,
It sounds like it.
yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have some other books or ideas for books in the offing?
Yeah. So I just finished the second draft, I guess, of it's a near future work of speculative fiction, and I hesitate to call it a satire. It has satirical elements. It's not a straight satire. It is. Should I just talk about the premise, or
Yeah, talk a little. Just give us a little teaser, because it's really.
So I'm
great
excited
idea.
about this. I am still unagented, and it has been getting a lot of interest from agents initially. So fingers crossed. I'll be workshopping it in November at the Wayward Wormhole Workshop. And so it's set in analog Santa Barbara, and it's 20 years in the future, 25 years in the future. And it's more or less, I keep calling it utopian and dis because it's set here, but it's also after a pretty significant civilizational fallout, and it's if Elon Musk had his way, his name is redacted. I actually call him Melon Husk in the book, but I'm debating about whether or not. I've had mixed feedback about, some people think it's hilarious and other people think it's a dated Twitter joke, which I didn't know it was a Twitter joke. So apparently I wasn't the first person to think of calling him this. If he had his way and got the 95% of people either in space, it's like they're either in space or they're waiting in a first come, first served line to get there. But it's not a story about the people that are going to space. It's the story about people that choose to stay behind. And so it's really a story about community and like the mundanity, which I think is like an interesting focus, the mundanity of living in an apocalypse, which I think is not often as focused on as the extremism of it. There are certainly extreme aspects. But yeah, so it's kind of like a love story to hear, and it's also born out of a bit of a fantasy of like, what if you could have any house you wanted here, and what if there weren't so many people? So yeah, it was a ton of fun to write. It's set over the course of a week, a little bit of autofiction, a lot of bit of absurdism, and yeah.
Well, I want to be part of that 5%.
Yeah,
So.
I think I tend to think that most people that would be shopping here are. Yeah.
Well, Maressa, thank you so much for talking about When Shadows Grow Tall, and Leslie, thank you for being a great interviewer. Maressa Voss, everyone.
Yay.